Oh, thank you all for coming. This is a special moment for me because Sam and I have been on parallel tracks in these two books from the beginning. Our relationship started with two conversations, right, not one, on the street, in which Sam came up to me initially and started talking about the Beacon School, where he had taught previously before embarking on this research project. And he told me that it was, this is the Beacon that used to be on West 61st Street behind Lincoln Center and is now in a much larger, more impersonal facility down at 44th Street. But the old school, which is what I wound up writing about, was cramped and crowded. It was never intended to be a school. It was a former storage place for ABC Television, which has its studios nearby. But it's a progressive school with a very interesting mixed student body, Sam told me. Rich, poor, middle class, ethnically very mixed. Hard-working place, not a slack, feel-good place, but definitely a progressive school. At that point, this was 5 years ago, more or less, I was interested in a question, which was how in the world do you get 15-year-olds, kids, but 15-year-olds I thought was the right age in particular, turned on to reading seriously, turned on to reading literature. I didn't know how to go about it. My wife and I were sitting around at dinner making lists of books. Does anyone read the Scarlet Letter anymore? You know, Lord of the Flies, all these books that were, part of the high school curriculum when we were kids. So I decided that I would check out Beacon, and I scouted it and looked at various teachers' classes and wound up embedding there for an entire year. Now, I'm not an education researcher. I'm not a teacher. I'm not an education theorist or specialist. I was a movie critic for 45 years, most recently for The New Yorker. I haven't been for the last 16 months, though I have a piece coming out on women in the 30s movies. But anyway, that part of my life is pretty much over. Movies are very important to me. I love going, and I'm a romantic of the old-fashioned movie experience. I like to sit with 500 strangers in a darkened room. I like to sit close enough so that I lose the edges of the frame, so that I'm engulfed. It's a sensory overload, which I love. And I remember when I saw The Godfather the first time in 1972, and I came out vibrating. And part of the reason I was vibrating, I got out on the street and I collected myself, was that Faye Dunaway was sitting next to me. But when I got home, when I get home generally after seeing, and of course most movie experiences are not like that, after that kind of experience, I would feel that I had somehow lost myself in some way and that I needed to recollect myself, regather myself. And for me, it's always been reading. It's always been more important. All those years, 45 years I made my living professionally. As a movie critic, I always counted reading as more important in learning about the world and learning about myself. And I am a firm believer that we cannot create a good civilization here without creating the next generation of readers, serious readers. I mean, you're seeing right now in this election what the loss of reading and critical thinking has done to a large part of the voting population. Anyway, the kind of book I wanted to write is something I had done before, in a way. And it's this book here, great books. 25 years ago, during the curriculum debate, should kids who are descended from Africa or South America, Latin America, be imposed upon with the Western classics? Do you remember all the hegemonic white males, all of that? So I went back to Columbia, where Sam and I went, and took the courses that were required of all freshmen and sophomores that we had each taken, as it happens, years and years earlier, and read the Western classics required courses again, sat there in the classroom, made notes, charted my own journey, charted the students' journey, and made my way through the books, and the result was that book, great book. So that was, I had a kind of working model, and this book, in it, so to speak, is a kind of, to use Hollywood talk, is a kind of prequel. 15-year-olds, 10th graders, the beginnings of serious intellectual life. That was the notion. So at Beacon, I selected a teacher named Sean Leon, 10th grade and 12th grade teacher, but I sat in on his 10th grade class for the entire year, every class. Sat on the side of the room, kept my mouth shut, which isn't easy. Put my rear against there was a table there with a lot of school texts on it, reared up there and took notes and took notes and took notes the entire year. Talked to students after class. Never opened my mouth during the classes unless Sean asked me something or other. Sean Leon was then about 39, Irish mother, American Navy father, raised in Louisiana, was a journalist for a while, became a teacher. He had a very unusual reading list. No Shakespeare, and I give him a hard time about that in the book. No Mark Twain, no Toni Morrison. They might read those books in other classes at Beacon, certainly. They read what you'd have to call existential classics. They read stories by Faulkner and Hawthorne, dystopian classics by Orwell and Huxley, Hermann Hesse, Kurt Vonnegut, Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, which is a dauntingly difficult text. It's the beginning of Dostoevsky's great period. Crime and Punishment came next, and then all the others. And the kids were flattered by the difficulty of the reading. They didn't buckle. They hung in there, and it's partially because this particular teacher was so good at engaging them. And one of the things he did was to pull them out of the text and get them to talk a little bit about their lives in the most essential way, not trivial stuff. What are you doing? What are you living for? What matters to you and what doesn't? I mean, I don't mean that this devolved into confessional sessions, but he would go to these personal conversations, and he would do them also about himself, and then go back to the text. So it always ended in literature. But it broke the normal constraints of classroom behavior in ways that were often very revealing. There was a lot of talk I recorded of family, of death, of loneliness, of connection and disconnection. I thought it was a remarkable talk for 10th grade. And it made those books important to those kids in a way that reading had not been before in their lives. There were only a few of them who I would say were dedicated readers from childhood. And I wound up tracking some of them and checking in on their reading habits, and I think they changed remarkably. Now, I mean, the question is, as people have asked from the beginning, is that kind of experience scalable, that awful word? Well, there's only one teacher named Sean Leon, obviously, but what allowed him to function, as Sam and I have discussed, was that the school gave him the latitude to teach this way, to choose those books. He had autonomy. I mean, you just couldn't assign anything. I mean, the list had to be okayed by the school's principal, a woman named Ruth Lacey. But she trusted him enough to allow him, and all the teachers there in the humanities, to design their curriculum to a degree that is unusual. That is, not typical in this country. And it gave them a kind of spirit about what they were doing, a sense of importance and intellectual status that is very important. Now, at the end of the year, I thought I think I've got a dramatic narrative here, because some of the kids emerged from their shells and began to become readers, to become persons, which is what the goal of all of this is, for heaven's sakes. But I knew that, there's no royal road to heaven, right? There's no perfect syllabus. There's no perfect teacher. I mean, and scalable or not, certainly parts of what Mr. Leon did could be done by other teachers in different schools all over the country. I still thought I needed more. So I needed a different school population. So I went up to New Haven to an inner city school, not a good school. The principal himself described it as a dumping ground. James Hillhouse High School, one of the two comprehensive high schools in New Haven, which has a very active magnet and charter school scene. Two comprehensive high schools, this was the poorer one. African American kids, 85% below the poverty line. I found a teacher there named Jessica Zelensky, white teacher, black kids. She was a local person from Connecticut. She is a remarkably funny, vibrant, tough teacher. If you think of Julia Roberts and Erin Brockovich, you sort of got the general idea. She has been teaching there about 10 years. At first, the kids didn't want to read at all. What is it? Read? Why should I be reading fiction? How is that going to help me? What is the purpose of it? How am I going to be benefited by reading fiction and poetry and essays? And they simply wouldn't do the assignments. They would come in looking blankly at her as if, it got lost. So she began reading in class. And the students were good functional readers. They just weren't eager to read. I don't mean that they couldn't read. They were good functional readers, actually. And she read with them To Kill a Mockingbird, which may seem strange with a bunch of African-American students. And she has read Zora Neale Hurston with them, and she's reading Ta-Nehisi Coates now with her 11th graders. She teaches African-American literature too. But in that year with those kids, a couple of years ago, she read To Kill a Mockingbird. So they studied, and they went around the room and read, and she got them to talk a lot about how do these people live? What do they eat? What's the class structure in town? What's the racial and class structure combined? What's the transportation? All the kind of details embedded in the novel in order to get them to be aware of those things in their own lives too. Because the trouble with these kids, from my observation, is that they lacked curiosity, avidity, which is a very general word, but meaning that desire of curiosity and enthusiasm to find out about their own lives and how they fitted into the society in which they lived. And by the way, these were very nice kids. That's an incidental remark, but it's just part of the picture. But what they lacked was the desire to grasp how they fit into the society and how they understood their immediate environs, certainly, how to get by in their neighborhood, how to get by with their families, how to stay safe on the streets, which is a serious problem in working-class New Haven. Well, they got past To Kill a Mockingbird, and they later read stories by Vonnegut and Hemingway, and by the end of the year, they were reading. They chose one of 4 books to read on their own, and then to make a presentation and report on it, and some written work. And many of them were particularly liked, and I can recommend this as a class text, Ishmael Bey's A Long Way Gone. Ishmael Bey was a boy soldier in Sierra Leone. He was, in effect, kidnapped by rebels and then worked for the government forces, and he, by his own account, killed a great number of people. When he was 13, 14, and 15, he came to the United States, had a very good English teacher and writing teacher at Oberlin, and wound up writing this terrific book, Long Way Gone. A miraculous thing happened at the end of the year. Had nothing to do with me, had nothing to do with this project, nothing to do with Jessica Zelensky. Ishmael Bey showed up. He gave a talk in New Haven. And so the kids in her class who had read that book got to see a living author and to make some connection between themselves, their own reading experience, and someone who actually produced a book that they had enjoyed reading. I think that was, I hope, a signal moment in their development. Now, I just want to tell you very briefly, I've already gone too long, right? very briefly. About a third school that's completely different in its approach. That's Mamaroneck High School, which is a public school in a wealthy upper middle class town, wealthy town up the coast, Connecticut coast, up the coast towards Connecticut on the Long Island Sound. They discovered, this English department and the school administration, to their dismay, a few years ago, that a lot of their kids simply weren't reading the assignments, weren't doing it, particularly the boys. They would read about the great Gatsby or Macbeth or whatever on Spark Notes or some other study aid, and they would brazen their way through classes and even paper writing without actually reading the books, and would even boast about it. So rather than scolding them, they tried something very different. They didn't withdraw their core text. You still read The Great Gatsby and Macbeth and Robert Frost and Emily Dickinson and so on in 10th grade there, but they also had to have a book of their own going at all times, a book of their own choosing. It doesn't matter where it came from. It could come from the school library, from the library in every classroom. It could come from the garbage dump. But they had to have something going, log in, contribute to Goodreads, the online site, and when they finished one book, they had to start another. So in other words, they were given great freedom, but they were also monitored at the same time. Now, what if they read the same kind of book over and over again? The idea here, as you have gathered, is to get them started on stuff that they really enjoy, to create that link with reading through pleasure. What if they read the same book over and over again, essentially the same book? So then you have a little conference with the kid and you say, I see you like horror genre fiction, that's fine. Let me tell you about this guy, Edgar Allan Poe. And, he wrote these hair-raising stories. In the 1840s, the Fall of the House of Usher, The Cask of Amontillado. And let me tell you about Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. In other words, they take them where they are in terms of pleasure and try to ladder them up into something more serious. So one of my general conclusions is that you create lifetime readers through forging the link either of need, as in the case of Sean Leon's students, where they needed to discuss these things in order to figure out who they were, or pleasure, as the Mamaroneck students who were engaged initially by what simply pleased them and then were pushed into doing something more serious. Your show.
Well, David, thank you for coming up. Can everybody hear me? David and I are very much on the same page, and my book is very much about the teacher. In fact, this book is dedicated to not only to teachers, but to graduates of Teachers College. Dorothy Bach, who was my sophomore English teacher at Holyoke High School in Holyoke, Massachusetts, she graduated from Teachers College with a master's degree in English instruction in 1949. She taught in the Holyoke Public Schools from 1955 to 1984. And Walter Clarkson, who got his master's degree here at Teachers College in 1957 and taught in Westfield, New Jersey, also his native town. Dorothy Bach was from Holyoke, from 1959 to 1990. Otherwise, this is very much a Teachers College product, and I would say a Teachers College accident. This book, and by the way, David's book and mine are both available in the pop-up store that they have in Everett Lounge at a discount. Is a consequence of a master's thesis. So as a teacher at Beacon, and I was a teacher for 18 years, and come to this from the perspective of a classroom teacher and miss the classroom very much as a researcher, though I do teach one course here on privatization, grew out of a master's thesis that I wrote under Henry Levin. And the rule in New York was that teachers, in order to be fully certified, had to get a master's degree. So I did a master's degree here. I was able to do it for free because Beacon was a cooperating school with Teachers College for students interested in progressive pedagogy and progressive pedagogy of public schools in particular. Teachers College didn't know, I don't think, that I didn't have a master's degree, but I was mentoring people who were studying to become teachers and consequently enabled to take 2 courses for free per semester. I wrote a thesis on Edison Schools, okay, the for-profit company, and Henry Levin said, this should become a book. And I took his advice and sent it around and got lucky and got a book contract. So that's what this book is. Now, the first 7 chapters are about the rise and fall of Edison. Then I have a chapter on market theory and why Edison was a bad idea from the beginning. And then 2 chapters on KIPP, which I argue constitutes a nonprofit version of Edison. And then a chapter on education in Sweden, which has gone down the path of privatization on roller skates with a cape, and a chapter on Finland, which is home to no privatization and arguably the best public school system in the world. I'm going to take you through a couple of slides, but what I want to say at the outset is that I understood back in 2001 when I became what's called the programmer, the scheduler at Beacon, and I was the programmer at that school for 7 years, deciding the master schedule, who took what course and who taught what course in which classroom and when and where and when, and then dealt with all the complaints in September from teachers, parents, and students alike, that the advocates of privatization were to some degree right. And in fact, the epigraph for my book is from Horace, Est modus in rebus. There's a middle ground for all things. So the advocates for privatization no doubt had an argument that some things were done better by outsiders. The argument that was being made by Edison was much bigger than that. And you can go back in time to Milton Friedman in 1955 in his seminal essay on the role of government in education. We can go back to 1955 for the first argument for vouchers. And it would get re-articulated by others, Myron Lieberman, Chubb and Moe, John Chubb and Terry Moe, and a slew of other advocates of the free market. What Edison got wrong, and this was clear to me as a teacher back in 2001, okay, that while some things could be outsourced, and I knew this as a programmer because we had to go outside for software for programming, because the programming software that we had from the New York City Board of Education was archaic. It was terrible. I wasn't a computer expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I knew that the computer software that we had was terrible. I went to an outside provider, and it made programming the school much, much easier. Okay, so I understood that if you're talking about software, or a textbook, or computers themselves, not just software, going to the outside makes total sense. Okay, you're talking about a discrete good or service. The argument by Edison and all of these other advocates of the free market, who were lifted in particular by the fall of the Berlin Wall, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and the laissez-faire triumphalism that prevailed in the wake of those developments, was that everything could be privatized. When I sat down with Chris Whittle in 2005 to talk about this matter, he made precisely that argument, that the book company, the pencil company, the milk company, everybody's making money from schools. Why can't we if we're managing schools? And what they did, Whittle and others, was they conflated services. If it's a discrete service or a discrete good, and the contract is very easy to measure and assess, you have the transparency necessary for proper contract enforcement. But in managing a school, your immediate consumer is a child. So you have asymmetry of information. And in essence, what Whittle and all these other people erred in this regard is they didn't do their homework. Edison pretty much doesn't exist anymore. The prediction on Wall Street back in the 1990s was that 10 to 20% of American public schools by 2010 would be run by for-profit firms. We have approximately 100,000 public schools in the United States. That means by 2010, there should have been 10,000 to 20,000 schools run for profit. In reality, there were 700. And people, the investors, lost their shirts. Merrill Lynch took Edison public in 1999 at $18 a share with 50 million shares outstanding. That's a $900 million company at the outset. By 2003, it was taken private at $1.76. Okay, it did go up to $38.75. Then on news of accounting irregularities that mimicked Enron, it fell to 14 pennies. Okay, this was a revenue recognition problem. I said to Chris Whittle, he said, when he asked me, he said, look, the computer company, the textbook company, all of these people, these companies make money from schools. Why can't we? I said, for the same reason that the Pentagon can outsource the production of helicopters and jet fighters and submarines to the likes of Northrop Grumman and General Dynamics, but they can't outsource the management of a division of the Army with 15,000 soldiers to General Dynamics and Northrop Grumman, for the very simple reason that you're talking about a complex service, and the soldier, the legislator, the taxpayer, the spouse can never know if national security and soldier safety is not being sacrificed in the name of profit. So you have client pushback. Now, the argument among economists as to why Edison and these other companies did not live up to Wall Street dreams was that it's too difficult to achieve economies of scale in a labor-intensive sector like education. If you grow a school, you have to add teachers. They're your unit of production. But the fact of the matter is law firms, consultancies, insurance companies, advertising firms are also labor-intensive. But the immediate consumer is an adult, and you're talking about a very discrete good or service. If it's McKinsey working for Delta and trying to figure out a new distribution strategy or a new advertising strategy, they're selling that service to the board of and the executives at Delta. And they can decide whether McKinsey has done a good enough job. But again, with education, the parent, the taxpayer, the legislator is necessarily at a distance, and we can't really know what's going on inside. So my argument was the economists were right, no doubt, that it's difficult to achieve economies of scale in a labor-intensive sector. Education is not like a pharmaceutical firm, okay? You invest several $100 million into research and development for that pill for depression or psoriasis, okay? And then your variable costs for the production of the pill are minimal. And over time, your average total costs come down and you make a profit. Still, law firms, advertising firms, insurance companies, they all have about 80% of their budgets dedicated to human capital, but they don't suffer from information asymmetry. So the first problem that these people made in their rush to judgment on the drug of the free market dream and fantasy, fed to them by Ayn Rand and others, was that everything could be turned into a market. They didn't do their homework. There's Ronald Coase, 1937, on the nature of the firm. Kenneth Arrow, 1963, on the difference between a doctor and a business person, okay? And then you have George Akerlof on lemons and cars and how much more that the salesman knows than the consumer. And Oliver Williamson and Henry Hansman. Decades of literature on the problem of asymmetry of information. Not everything can be for sale. Education can't work that way because you simply do not have the transparency necessary for proper contract enforcement. The second problem is they just simply, and this feeds into the first problem, it's kind of circular, is they didn't know schools. Okay, you cannot coach a sport you never played. Take a look at any NHL game, any WHL game, OHL game, I love hockey, okay, any basketball game, volleyball game, whatever. That coach on the bench may not have been a great competitor, but she played the game. She knows the game. So many people running these for-profits, and the fact of the matter is this extends to federal and state education policy, never played the game. This is a product of the arrogance of business. It's a product of the arrogance of money. We have so many people who've made policy in this country and continue to make policy without having put in their time in the classroom. You have to know what the challenges that David was talking about with respect to Jessica Zielinski and Sean Leon are involved with to manage schools and design testing mechanisms to assess what's happening. Now, in this regard, Whittle and Benno Schmidt, drafted from the presidency of Yale University, who made the front page of the New York Times back in 1992 to become the head of Edison, okay? All of these people had never been classroom teachers. What they didn't get, as I said, from their lack of experience was understanding how these schools worked. But where they did succeed, with this emphasis on results and efficiency, that's what they pounded on, efficiency and results, is they implicitly influenced federal and state policy. Okay? I don't think you can separate the rise of Edison. Okay, this company was started in 1992. They didn't man schools until 1995. From No Child Left Behind, which became policy in 2003. It was passed in Congress in 2001, signed into law by George Bush in 2002, became policy by 2003, raced to the top in 2009. The architect of which taught for 1 year at a private school outside of Paris, France, not Texas, okay, where you tie teacher pay to student performance on exams, which is lunacy. The perverse consequences are legion, okay? And we're not much better off now with the redesign, the updated version of No Child Left Behind with every Student Succeeds Act. We've deputized a lot of the law from the federal level to the state level, but we're still testing students in English and math, 3rd grade through 8th grade, 1 year in high school, and sometimes, depending on the state, in more years of high school than that. We don't need to do any of this, okay? All we need to do is sample. So the reason why that last chapter is on Finland is because they really are doing things right. And a lot of people reflexively say, Finland, it's irrelevant, it's small, it's homogeneous, it's egalitarian. Wrong. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, small, homogeneous, egalitarian. Their scores on international assessments are the same as ours. The difference, if you're a teacher in Finland, okay, you get a terrific 5-year program, prep program, okay, with a master's degree. It's not true in Denmark, Norway, Sweden. You are paid more on average, okay, especially at the upper secondary level, than your college classmate. So if you became a teacher and your college classmate became an accountant, okay, for example, at the upper secondary level, and your college classmate is making $50,000 as an accountant, you're making $55,000 as a teacher. In the United States, your college classmate from the University of Connecticut, for example, is making $50,000 as an accountant, you're making $32,500 as a teacher. You are priced out. Teaching can't thrive that way, okay? Sean Leone, Jessica Zelensky, the people that David just hailed, they're saints, but you can't build a system on sainthood, okay? And then as far as Finland is concerned, by contrast to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, I'll show you some slides in a second, the only country that does sampling, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, do this very similar kind of testing to the kind of testing we do. And they test students every year. We don't need the data. I happen to have a book here that I rely on a lot, Out of the Crisis by W. Edwards Deming. Because the fact of the matter is the business principles we apply to education are lousy business principles. W. Edwards Deming saved the Japanese auto industry. He is a god in Japan. There's a Deming Prize. He taught at the Columbia Business School for a long time, by the way. And there's a Deming Prize here at the Columbia Business School. And Deming was against merit pay because he thought, and he documented quite well, that merit pay splintered people. It helps people who know how to succeed in a system, but it doesn't help the system. It pits people against each other. And he was against sloganeering. And most of all, he was against massive assessment. If you have 1,000 cars rolling off an assembly line a day, take one, take it apart. Just one. And that's what the Finns do in sampling. In my book, I have, for the first time, I believe, published, it was very hard for me to get this, from the Finnish National Assessment Council, the way they do testing, okay? They test every subject, not just reading and math. They do it over 10 years. They only do 2 subjects a year, and they do 10% of 9th grade, okay? So that's under 1% of the whole student population. And you know how they pick their sample? They go into a school, and they say, everybody born on the 3rd, 17th, and 25th of the month, come on down to the cafeteria. That's 10%. That's all you need. And they're very well done tests. So they don't just do testing in reading and math. They do testing in civics. They do testing in music. 2 written exams plus 4 hours to compose and perform a piece of music. Woodshop. 4 hours to design a birdhouse or whatever it is that you want to, or a dollhouse, and make it, okay? Physical fitness and agility. It's over 10 years. The only thing that they do over a long period of time is mathematics. They take a cohort of 6,000 students in third grade. They test them again in sixth grade, ninth grade, 12th grade. So I'll just show you a couple of quick slides here. See if I know how to do this, okay? I'm a Luddite, all right? So testing and its perverse consequences. And what you have here is you'll see 3 spikes, okay? Now, in the first 2 cases, what I did was I traced the path of a principal who was celebrated on the front page of the Baltimore Sun and celebrated by Edison Schools as a turnaround genius. But there were reports of test tampering at this school. I learned about this in interviewing a guy named Bob Embry, the head of the Able Foundation, the local version of the Ford Foundation in Baltimore, that there were concerns that there was test tampering. So you can see that last one spike up from nowhere, and Edison was celebrating their approach, and this was back in 2002 when they were campaigning to take over 45 schools in Philadelphia. They were sending busloads of parents and teachers to Baltimore to see the school in action. Total fraud. And I was able to document it by going through 16 years of testing data. Wherever this principal was, the scores spiked. Then she left, okay? And in 2 cases, and actually in both cases, state authorities went in to monitor the exams, and the exams plummeted. So that's one consequence of high-stakes testing, okay? Here's another thing. Now, Edison and its critics would fight back and forth about whether they improved reading and math scores. But there was an end run, as they say in football. I wasn't going to compete with a RAND corporation and a couple of professors at Harvard who did these very sophisticated statistical assessments of the reading and math scores at Edison. What I did was I took a look at the scores in writing and science. Now, writing and science are subjects that Pennsylvania tested their students in 5th and 8th grade, okay? But they didn't get reported for determining something called adequate yearly progress to meet the standards set up by the federal government. Now, if you can measure what doesn't get measured, you can measure a great deal. So I didn't compete with Rand and Harvard and these other people, Johns Hopkins and elsewhere. What I did was something that they didn't do. I took a look at the writing and science scores. Now, this is kind of hard to see, but in a nutshell, Edison stopped teaching writing. They stopped teaching science. Now, I knew this because I was spending time in schools, and all they were doing was reading and math, because that's what was going to determine their contract renewal. I was told by teachers they weren't teaching history or science. Forget about art or music or play, which are fundamental to a well-rounded education. So what you'll see here over time is a huge spread between the reading and writing scores. At the outset, they're tight. But even Philadelphia, okay, as I said, Edison didn't have to succeed to succeed. They influenced federal and state policy. And they stopped teaching writing. And they had a writing curriculum in place. I asked an Edison administrator, I said, what the heck happened to these writing scores? And he said, well, we had a writing curriculum in place. We were very proud of it. We boasted that we were going to provide a world-class education to these students. But reading and math scores became the currency of the company. So that's what we focused on. Okay. Now, as far as I said, beforehand I said the people at Edison and on Wall Street didn't know what they were talking about because they frankly had not done their homework on information asymmetry, okay? And we've got, as I said, decades of economic literature about the problem of information asymmetry. The contract has to be sufficiently transparent for proper enforcement, okay? But the other thing is they didn't take into consideration what Michael Rebell has been focused on so long, okay? And that's fiscal equity. So what I did is I created a school district, main line, okay? Now, David's the movie expert. You probably know the Philadelphia story with Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart and Katharine Hepburn. That movie was made in 1940. Philadelphia really hasn't changed much since 1940. What I have here are the per capita expenditures, okay, per student, rather, per pupil expenditures for Philadelphia, and then for the 5 districts through which that train of privilege travels, okay? Now, the suburbs, it's Haverford, Great Valley, Radnor, Lower Merion, and Tredyffin Easttown. Okay, I'm probably mangling the pronunciation of that last one. The per pupil expenditure in Philadelphia is 70%. That's what it was. What's that first year? Can't see. 1995-96. That's what it was in 2013. Nothing's changed. Jonathan Kozol wrote a great book called Shame of the Nation, Apartheid in America's Schools. This is a disgrace. And for Edison to say they can go into Philadelphia and make a big difference with all their efficiency, granted, the public school system's inefficient. I brought along this quick book. I'm almost done. Brick of a book by David Rogers. It's a favorite of mine on the bureaucratic pathology of the New York City school system. I witnessed it myself as the programmer. It exists. Okay? But this says a lot more. Okay? This has to be tackled. How is it that children in Lower Merion, okay, are getting so much more per pupil? On top of that, they get summers in Maine and cello lessons and tennis lessons, okay? And you're talking about kids in West Philly, North Philly, who are so deprived. Oh, let's see. Okay, this is the science story. So main line all the way to the right. I'm comparing apples to apples. These are economically disadvantaged kids. Now, Mastery and KIPP are two charter networks, okay? They have schools in Philadelphia. They're about no excuses, working hard. Their math scores are the black bars. They're quite high. They actually outperform. This is a composite of 5 years of data. Look at the main line, okay? So that gray bar, the next bar, the second bar on the right, are science scores. You have labs. You've got experienced teachers. The teacher turnover rate at these schools, the charter, no excuses charter schools, is abominable. Okay? Sean Leone, Jessica Zelensky as examples. They've been in the profession, they stay with it. You can't teach for 2 years and know much. And the turnover has a terrible effect. So that right there is quite telling. You're not learning science in Philadelphia or even the good charter schools. Teacher prep and student performance in science. Now this, everybody dismisses Finland as too small and egalitarian, homogeneous. Norway, Sweden, United States, Denmark, okay? The mean score is a 500. A standard deviation is 100 points, okay? And Norway, Sweden, Denmark, this is over 5 administrations, 2000, 2003, 2006, 2009, 2012. Their average over that period of time is a 494. The United States is a 496. The United States doesn't have an educational crisis. We have a crisis in our inner cities for poor kids and in rural areas that are underserved. We don't really have an education crisis. Nobody's been complaining about that in Norway, Sweden, or Denmark. Finland, a 550, okay? The only explanation that makes any sense for that is the teacher preparation, the treatment, the pay, right here. Teacher prep and experience, they do labs all the time. I've spent time in schools in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden for comparative purposes. They don't do labs. They have 16 in the class. You learned hockey by playing hockey, and anything, music by you don't. And why is this clicker not working? Where am I supposed to be pointing it? Up. Okay. More labs here. That school was in an immigrant section beforehand in eastern Helsinki. This is in Jyväskylä in the north. Teacher pay, again, this is what I was talking about before. The United States, way below. We're not going to achieve anything unless we address poverty, teacher preparation, and teacher pay. Teacher treatment, the lab, these are lounges. I'm almost done. School in Jyväskylä, another school in Jyväskylä, another school outside of Jyväskylä. That's the bathroom. That's the men's bathroom, okay? Now, I'm an aggressive researcher, but I didn't go into the women's bathroom. And this is the locker room. I don't know where I'm supposed to point this. Okay, there we go. This is where I taught. That's the last slide. Now, I took a Finnish researcher, a friend of mine named Pasi Solberg, gave him a tour of Beacon. And at the end of the tour, I said, Pasi, here's the faculty lounge. Now, I had read in a French magazine I read called Le Nouvel Observateur, The New Observer, back in 2005, This French journalist went up to Finland after seeing these great Finnish scores. Like, what the heck is the difference? She went to the lounge of the school, the teacher's lounge. She said, this is amazing. So every school, and I spent time in 15 different schools across Finland, I always visited the teacher's lounge. Now that's Beacon. That's the Beacon David spent a year at. That's the teacher's lounge in a windowless room in the basement, mismatched furniture. In chaos theory, we talk about fractals and how they can microcosmically tell a big story. That, I think, says a great deal. Okay, we have time now for questions, right? Okay.
Do we have exactly 10 minutes? Yes. Is that the story?
That's correct. Maybe we should open it. Do you want to open? Do you want to have one question?
Well, I was hoping we could talk about KIPP.
Okay.
Because a good part of the book is about KIPP, and you say business assumptions, business practices were applied in the KIPP charter chain, which is the most successful of the charter chains, but a nonprofit, and the strengths and weaknesses thereof. Because KIPP is explicitly aimed at helping inner city kids, right?
Yeah.
And 88, something like % of them are below the poverty line, mainly African American and Latino school populations. The scores are slightly higher.
They can be a lot higher.
They can be a lot higher.
Much higher.
The rate of KIPP graduates, and KIPP stops, well, there are KIPP high schools also, but it stops at 8th grade, and then there are 20-odd high schools, but usually you go to some other school. The rate of graduation of former KIPP students of four-year colleges, they are now claiming at 45%. Yep. That is higher than the national rate for everyone in this country. It's about a dozen points higher, yes. And it's incomparably higher than the rate of those kids' peers, right, who stay in the neighborhood and don't go to a KIPP school, which is I think about 8 or 9%. So those are results, right, that are inarguable. Now, the downside, as you develop in your text, and this is extremely important to me, and I think it should be to everyone, is how do you get there, and what has been lost, what has been sacrificed. First of all, you don't apply to KIPP unless you've got a guardian, a parent, an uncle, an aunt, or someone who's hip to the system, right? So there's a degree. That was obvious even in the movie, the very much pro-charter school movie, Waiting for Superman. Second, KIPP people managed to not take English language learners or kids with disabilities in the same percentages that the regular district schools take. I mean, a place like Hill House can't turn anybody away. I mean, they have kids who have been incarcerated. They have kids who have been pushed out of charter schools. Third, the attrition rate. And why don't you explain how that works and how attrition happens?
Okay, David, you've nailed something very important. And I'm happy you mentioned Hill House. I write in my book that KIPP, Mastery, Achievement First, Uncommon Schools, these no excuses charter networks, and Catholic schools succeed in part because they don't have to succeed.
Explicate that.
Hill House has to take everybody, okay? The charter networks don't have to succeed with every student, okay? The students can drop out. So my argument, I think KIPP has done some very good things. Same thing is true with Achievement First. I've spent a lot of time in KIPP schools and Mastery schools, and I spent one day at 5 Achievement First schools. That was quite a day in New Haven. And these networks suffer from 3 limitations. First of all, they're heavily dependent on philanthropic largesse. Second, they're heavily dependent on teachers who can work extremely hard, okay? They're tireless teachers. I profile one named Frank Corcoran, who's a saint, literally, in the Bronx. He gets there at 6:30. He stays till 6:30. He has an extra bedroom in his apartment a couple of blocks away for students who need a place to stay. But even he told me that this was too much after 20 years, and he was paying students to grade his papers and treating them to dinner, that it's an overwhelming job. And the teacher attrition rate is 33% per year. Now, if you do that over time, 2 over 3 multiplied by 2 over 3, this is not sophisticated mathematics, by 2 over 3, after 6 years you have 13% of your faculty. You don't have any institutional stability, memory. You don't have teachers mentoring teachers. Okay, there's a lot of research that says that teachers are only effective, don't get any more effective after 7 years. That comes from people who've never taught. That's from economists who don't know anything about the classroom, because you need senior teachers to steer junior teachers. Okay? What these economists love to do is come up with fancy correlations of test data, and they don't know what they're talking about, because there are implicit effects of a senior teacher. The third thing, the limitation, this is maybe the most constraining Procrustean limitation of the no excuses approach. It can work for a subset of students. And as it grows, now they're up to 183 schools. Okay, they had 162 last year. It's grown a lot. But it can't work. Not only so many students can abide by those rigid behavioral and academic expectations.
But there may be a perfectly gifted student who just develops under a different regimen, or it's a more gentler,
absolutely,
more patient
right.
regimen. So in other words, it helps those whom it can help. Now that's a tautology,
right.
But that's what it comes down to. I mean, it so to speak selects the product it wants.
Right. And Mark Sternberg, the head of the Walton Family Foundation, who's a big advocate of no excuses charter schools and vouchers, has said in response to critics, what's the solution? Don't help anybody until you can help everybody? And that's a legitimate, pragmatic response, okay? These are earnest people trying to make a difference. But in terms of making national policy and thinking that this can really transform life chances for poor children, it's delusional. Now, what they've done, which is quite good, is shown what can work with a subset of students. And what we should do is build on that for the students that David just mentioned and use the community school approach. So, heavy remediation, a longer day with music, art, crafts, play afterwards, and integrated medical, dental, and counseling services. This costs money, okay? But it costs a lot more not to do it.
In my utopia, the schools of the futures would be community centers doing exactly what you're saying, maybe even assisted living also. I mean, they would be schools that also provided medical services. What Jeffrey Canada, I think, has got the right idea. Baby college, instruction for moms and dads, certainly how to raise children, providing materials, books, toys, and so on, nutritional advice, and so on. And I mean, in other words, what's behind what we're all saying is that poor kids fall behind in the years 0 to 6. We're not talking about race here. We're talking about poverty. All of these generalizations could be applied to the white poor also. The avidity that I missed in those kids at 15 at Hill House was the result of the way they were brought up in that community, and the demands that were and weren't made on them. So, I mean, the utopian solution is the school as a kind of community center that helps in particular in those early years.
And the fact of the matter is, it's done in the Nordic world. I mean, and if you go to Finland or Denmark or Norway or Sweden, and ultimately it costs less, I think you can do a cost-benefit analysis in many different ways, okay? Now, you don't have people in Finland with 35 Porsches like Jerry Seinfeld, okay? I don't think he's 35 times happier because he has 35 Porsches and not one.
Who knows?
I'll bet he's not 35 times happier, okay? But we can't have this income disparity and fund the kind of programs that you have in Denmark or Finland. People don't have 35 Porsches in Finland, okay? It would be actually considered piggish to do that.
You're demanding, in essence, a different social contract than the one we have.
Yeah, we don't have a social contract right now. I mean, essentially, we have a threadbare social contract. We can look at this problem with our eyes wide open, or we can continue this march of folly. And right now, it's a march of folly. And but we can easily fund these things. And This is what they do in these other countries that have a responsible attitude toward other people's children.
Just want to pick up, and we just got another minute. One of the things that you said in passing was that the imposition of business and competitive notions upon the school cultures just doesn't fit because it seems to me unlikely that those who are drawn to teaching are hyper-competitive by nature. Right. In other words, and you mentioned just now the influence of senior teachers on junior teachers and how important that is. The importance of sharing, particularly with young children, right, I would think, is paramount. So you have a model that is turning teachers with all these, as test assessments determining employability in extreme cases. We're turning teachers into sort of individual operators. What's in it for me? I'm against everyone else, rather than how do I help this community and how does this community help me? Okay, and it's absolutely ass backward.
It is. But you've nailed a critical thing that I talk about in Chapter 8. And Richard Titmuss wrote about this in 1970 on the gift relationship on blood donation. If you pay people to give blood, do you collect more blood? No. It backfires. People give blood to feel good about themselves as citizens. People teach to feel good about themselves as citizens. Rachel Cranton and George Akerlof wrote a brilliant book about this called Identity Economics. I cite it. And in the classical economic context, consumers try to maximize their consumption and get those 35 Porsches, okay? But that's not how everybody works. And what George Akerlof and Rachel Cranton say, and this applies to teachers and what David was just talking about, is that a lot of people try to maximize not their utility as consumers, but their utility as servants of a cause. That's who teachers are. And that's why this individualized approach to merit pay and getting scores up doesn't make any sense. And these people would know it had they spent some time in the classroom.
Yeah. Do we have to terminate? It's 3:31.
I think, well, everybody has to get to another session. And
oh.
When's the next session?
The next session is at
3:45.
Yeah.
Can we take 5 minutes of questions?
5 minutes, sure.
Okay.
I mean, if people who have to leave,
okay,
just quietly.
Well, you were talking about some models that actually do work in our society. So Head Start really works.
Right.
And the school that my son went to in Chinatown, Lower East Side, they have a dentist come in, they have parent counseling, they have nutrition counseling.
There you go.
They teach people how to cook.
Yeah.
They take care of the grandparents who don't speak English, who are the ones that are really minding the children and can't negotiate the neighborhood, that kind of thing. So that is kind of a community center as well. And
How often does that happen in this city?
yeah.
Rarely.
I mean, it's in a neighborhood that has traditionally had social service agencies, so I think that's the
Yeah.
norm in that area of the city, but, yeah.
Yeah.
And it is a public school.
Great.
yep.
In New Jersey, they have the Abbott ruling, right?
Yep.
So most of the traditionally poorest cities are the best funded.
Right.
How do you explain the lack of equality for funding in those districts as well?
Okay. Now, as Dale Rusikoff documented in the prize, you have still a great deal of bureaucratic pathology, in the words of David Rogers, in Newark and a lot of these big city school systems. On top of that, teachers, again, you know too well, you are a teacher, okay? It's tough to get people who aren't saints. You shouldn't have to be a saint to be a teacher, okay? It's a profession, and it's very important for society. And third, as you know so well from, this is your 4th year, is that right? Yep, okay. You're dealing with grinding poverty. And David said before, those years 0 to 6, they're so formative. Now we're learning about lead poisoning in Newark, which is yet another illustration of this problem. So as far as results are concerned in Newark, you have what John Kenneth Galbraith called back in 1958 in his classic, The Affluent Society, marooned populations. Marooned populations, not integrated at all with the rest of the world. You have bureaucratic pathology that's got to be addressed, and you need to make teaching more attractive.
Why don't I just take one more question, just
Okay.
to give people time?
So
like the parent of the third grader in the poor neighborhood who's like, my kid can't read, the government hasn't done anything for us for the last 200 years, especially for communities of color, like, why are we supposed to suddenly trust, like, this next group of white dudes who's telling us that this is what's best for our students?
People operate on the margin, right? Okay? As economists like to put it. And you think about your individual situation, so you're absolutely right, okay? If you're in a tough neighborhood and there's an opportunity to send your child to a high-performing charter school, it's completely understandable why you go down that path. And this is why Dave Levin and Mike Feinberg started KIPP back in 1995, because they were so frustrated, 1994, because they were so frustrated with what they saw in Houston. But operating on the margin is not the way the leaders of this country should be thinking. And that's why I said it's ultimately delusional, because we'll have this small percentage of students who are excelling that David cited, but that doesn't make a difference for so many other people. So if you think about it on the individual level as that parent of that third grader in that tough neighborhood, you're absolutely right. You do what you can. You don't forge social policy with your own child, okay? You can't. We're talking about people in Washington and Albany and Hartford and Boston and on Wall Street in particular, who are pulling the levers in Washington, D.C.
All right, thank you very much.